Bienvenue à tout le monde. Welcome
everyone.
this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 17 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defense. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule sous...
Today's meeting is in a hybrid format, pursuant to the order adopted January 25th, 2020, and the members will be present in person or using the Zoom application. The deliberations will be published on the website of the House of Commons. For information purposes, the web live stream will always show the person speaking rather than the whole committee.
Working on that in this current format, so I'm going to skip some of the detailed health procedures. I think we all understand what they are. So please, before you speak, please wait until I recognize you by name. And a reminder that all comments by members should be addressed through the chair. And I say this as a reminder to myself, mostly, but when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. And when you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. All right. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February the 9th, 2021, the committee is resuming its study of addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. With us today by video conference, Dr. Alan English, Captain Retired from the Canadian Forces. Dr. Alan Okros, also Captain Retired from the Canadian Forces. Dr. Stephanie von Latke, who is currently the Honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the Princess of Wales Regiment. Up to 6 minutes will be given for opening remarks, and I would like to start by welcoming Dr. Alan English to start with his opening remarks, please.
Excuse me. Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. Madam Chair and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I am Alan English, and I teach Canadian military history in the History Department at Queen's University. I have also taught senior officers at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto. I served for 25 years in the RCAF and CAF as an air navigator on the C-130 Hercules, as well as a number of instructional tours. The title of my presentation, Culture Eats Policy Every Time, Sexual Misconduct in the CAF, come from a statement by former Supreme Court of Canada Justice Michel Bastarache when referring to attempts to change the RCMP's culture through policy changes. His statement applies equally to the CAF, which over the last 30 years has attempted to address sexual misconduct through policy changes and added training without successfully implementing what Justice Marie Deschamps referred to in her report on sexual misconduct and sexual harassment in the CAF as, quote, comprehensive culture change, unquote, necessary to, quote, eliminate harmful and inappropriate sexual behavior within the CAF, unquote. In evaluating the success of Operation In Honor in testimony before a Senate committee in May 2018, almost 3 years after the operation started, Justice Deschamps made these comments, which she reiterated in her testimony here this week. Quote, in the public policies, the changes that have been made to them are so minor as to be virtually superficial. Much more could have been done in 3 years. What I see is that not a lot of progress has been made, unquote. In August 2015, in the Operation Honor campaign plan, General Vance required the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff to, quote, complete a comprehensive strategy by 30 September 2015, unquote. However, no strategy was produced until 2020. Lacking a guiding strategy, Much like Operation Minerva, one of the CAF's piecemeal and uncoordinated plans to implement mandated gender integration and to respond to its quote-unquote rape crisis in the 1990s, its actions in response to Justice Deschamps' report have been uncoordinated and unprioritized. While many early changes made by Operation Honor were positive and addressed the CAF's initial priority of meeting victims' needs, they only addressed the symptoms of the problem. They did not deal with its main cause, the CAF's, quote, hostile organizational culture that is disrespectful and demeaning to women, unquote. Leader buy-in is essential if desired culture change is to be made and successfully implemented. Yet, despite emphatic public statements promising to eliminate sexual misconduct in the CAF, we now know that its senior leadership did not fully accept Justice Deschamps' conclusions. Starting with the response to her report by the CDS at the time, General Tom Lawson, who said, quote, I do not accept from any quarter that this type of behavior is part of our military culture, unquote. Recently, former Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, Lieutenant General retired Guy Thibault, who was the person charged with the oversight of Operation Honor during its first year, said, quote, I know that I and many of my colleagues initially had a hard time believing the picture painted by Justice Marie Deschamps in her 2015 report on sexual misconduct, as her descriptions of the CF work environment simply did not match our lived experience in the forces, unquote. The current CDS, Admiral Art MacDonald, also recently acknowledged that as a senior leader, he was, quote, guilty, even though it was unintentional, of having perpetuated some of the problems that the military is now trying to address, unquote. The latest allegations of sexual misconduct against General Vance are not the first indications of his lack of acceptance of the Deschamps report's findings. His reaction to the December 2017 party flight cast doubt on the CAF's commitment to eliminating sexual misconduct. In response to media reports of inappropriate behavior on the party flight, Vance said, quote, that what happened on the flight might have been exaggerated, unquote. That statement, combined with the lack of action to stop inappropriate behavior by the senior CAF leaders on the party flight, indicated to many that 2 years after being implemented and just over 5 months into Operation Honor's final maintain and hold phase, the CAF's initiative to eliminate sexual misconduct in its ranks had failed. In case there is any doubt that the CAF still does not fully accept Justice Deschamps' conclusions, the path to dignity and respect, the CAF's strategy to address sexual misconduct, released in October 2020, only calls for, quote, unquote, realigning the CAF's culture, not comprehensive culture change. In conclusion, until the CAF makes comprehensive culture change called for by Justice Deschamps, any change made by the bureaucratic methods used to date will be ephemeral and inconsequential, as was the case with Operation Minerva in the 1990s. Unless the CAF addresses the cause of its problems, its culture, not just their symptoms, and has its actions monitored by effective external oversight, it is likely to face disappointment and problems in the future as the sources of the CAF's sexualized and hostile culture remain in place. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Dr. Van Lapke, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm a professor of political studies and Canada Research Chair on Gender Security in the Armed Forces at Queen's University. I'd like to start with a question. Can a large organization like the Canadian Armed Forces transform its culture in 5 years, guided by an external review and driven by an order to eradicate sexual misconduct within the ranks? It might seem impossible, but in many ways, the military as a total organization might be better suited than most when it comes to adapting quickly in the face of adversity. CAF personnel are trained to make and carry out decisions in complex environments. So why is this reputation for operational excellence not carrying over organizationally? That's because military culture can have unintended consequences. It can also be gamed by predators, and it can be idealized and made to look untouchable by routines, traditions, and rigidly hierarchical command structures. At this time, military leaders need to re-engage with the External Review Authority report, also known as the Deschamps report, and think more boldly about implementing its recommendations fully. 5 years might not be enough time to implement deep, transformative cultural change, but it's certainly long enough to uncover the failings of the current approach. I've chosen 4 specific issues to discuss with you today. First, there should be a greater focus on abuses of power. What I'm referring to here is a social dynamic that is interlinked with sexual misconduct in highly asymmetric professional relationships. This kind of implicit or explicit pressure is far more endemic and ingrained in the culture than is currently acknowledged. While the survey on sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces has provided useful data, more is needed to examine how sexual misconduct interacts with consent in asymmetric professional relationships. A woman or any harassed person not speaking out against behavior that is inappropriate does not mean that behavior is welcome or that she is providing consent. There are many legitimate reasons for going along with these unwelcome interactions and staying silent. Many of these reasons are outlined in the Deschamps report. People who are more junior or in more precarious employment conditions fear for their job. They might fear other types of consequences at work, like not being believed by their peers or being socially ostracized for speaking out. Another reason for not coming forward is not trusting the reporting process or not believing that you'll secure a fair outcome. The next step is to have this more nuanced talk about consent and about consent when power dynamics are at play. Some of those power dynamics are inherent to military culture, and some of those dynamics are about rank and translate into abuses of power. Both types of power dynamics disproportionately impact women. Training. Op honor training should be improved to pull data from the StatsCan surveys to tailor the content to those receiving the training. The information in the training should be personalized by making clear that sexual misconduct affects friends and colleagues in the armed forces. Service members should engage and practice difficult scenarios so they know when to intervene and how. The resentment of mostly male service members who feel they are unfairly targeted by op honor is common and unfortunate. At the same time, the training is too focused on the perpetrator, while it could engage with military culture, militarized masculinity, the underrepresentation of women, consent, the needs of victims and survivors, empowering bystanders in small interactive sessions led by someone who can speak in an authentic way about the content. External experts can help in this regard, if only to provide a peer review function for the training materials. The SMRC, one of the most talked about ERA recommendations was that a reporting line outside of the chain of command was needed, which prompted the creation of the Sexual Misconduct Response Center as an independent body. There's an inherent tension in the SMRC's work because of the nature of its mandate. On the one hand, the SMRC needs to hold the CAF accountable, but it also needs a good working relationship with the CAF, including with the chain of command, which might undermine perceptions of the SMRC's independence. Constant review and oversight of the SMRC, both through internal self-assessments and external audits, might be needed as the protection of the SMRC's independence in the face of its growing mandate is paramount. Finally, the path to dignity and respect. The path is a promising approach because it puts culture and climate front and center, thereby making cultural change everyone's business. But while it makes sense for this document to define culture and climate along with a series of indicators, it should dedicate more attention to describing the problem at hand, sexual misconduct and how it ties to culture and climate. Basically, the scope of the problem needs to be crystal clear before jumping into the solutions. A journey of cultural change needs to convey shared responsibility for sexual misconduct. The percentage of CAF members who have witnessed sexual misconduct is pretty astounding. But how many people intervene, speak up, report? If one does not engage in sexual misconduct, it does not mean you perform your duty with honor. The standard of performance is much higher than that if you want to get to zero tolerance. It is the notion of collective responsibility that should be stressed more forcefully throughout the document because everyone can do better on this front. This is not about the duty to report, it's about a standard of daily conduct. The challenge moving forward is not simply about how to eradicate sexual misconduct within the military, but entails identifying positive steps to create a culture of equality for women in the CAF and a culture centered around respect for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Dr. Okros, I know you gave a shortened statement with us. Would you like to highlight or go through your statement again? It has been distributed, but it might be helpful for people to hear it once again if you're prepared to do that.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, thank you. Madam Chair, I'm speaking to you from Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. I have been engaged on issues of harassment in the CAF for over 40 years, and I see strengths and weaknesses in the current version of the movie. Leaders at all levels are seeking to address issues and do the right thing. The supporting functions provided by the SMRC are helpful, and the recent path has some promising ideas. But Operation Honor has not had the results intended. Why? The reason, which my two colleagues have alluded to as well, has been an incomplete understanding of the issues, which has led to incomplete solutions, and underpinned by unwillingness to critically assess certain aspects of CAF identity and culture. 6 years ago, General Lawson said CAF culture and behaviors had improved from the 1990s. While he was correct, the CAF had not been attending to evolutions across society. Expectations around the standard of workplace conduct have continued to rise. People are no longer prepared to ignore, endure, or accept behaviors that may not have been called out in the past. So while there has been some progress in the last 5 years, the gap has likely grown yet again. I'll then note that 2 years ago, senior leaders said they didn't know what the root causes are. External experts said they did, but weren't being listened to. The problem is that the issue has been framed as about sexual misconduct. The description of the term in Operation Honor puts the emphasis on the first word, describing it as sexual advances, sexual overtures, flirting, etc. There are CAF members who annoy people with overtures, but the key issue is not about sex. If I hit you with a shovel, you wouldn't call it inappropriate gardening. It's about power. It's using sexually and racially coded language to create and police social hierarchies about who is important and who is not. The death of 1,000 cuts damages an individual's self-worth, identity, and sense of belonging. That's what's being broken, not people feeling uncomfortable seeing an explicit picture or hearing an off-color joke. The path starts to expand the framing of the problem. It's taken 40 years, but it's a good first step. It acknowledges that there are culture factors that can increase incidents of sexual misconduct, but the door is only open very slightly. There are a couple of carefully worded statements that gender stereotypes, outdated conceptions of the warrior, and a male-dominated workforce can create harmful culture dynamics, but nothing more, and nothing of substance in the rest of the document to address even these factors. The key omission is the continued reluctance to name power and militarized masculinities. This requires a careful and critical analysis of how the military constructs the soldier, sailor, and aviator, and equally the leader and commander. We need to examine the institutionalized and systemic processes that shape military identity and ask the question, how much of one's identity do they have to give up in order to be successful in the CAF? Most of those leading today have not had to think about this. Left-handed people know they live in a right-handed world, Right-handed people don't. It isn't apparent to us when the world is constructed to fit us. The CAF was likely a good fit for most seniors, and we still have some who don't realize or can't see why it isn't a good fit for others. They continue to use terms and narratives that they believe resonate with all, but actually serve to accentuate the dominant identity, hence increasing the social hierarchies and leaving some feeling isolated, ignored, or not valued for who they are. The path indicates that work will be done to update professional development and enhance leadership capacities. Both are needed, but should be informed by analyses of CAF identity and the practices of militarized masculinities. As part of analyses, I would highlight a 2016 U.S. Equal Opportunities Commission report that identified 12 factors that increase the risk of workplace harassment. The CAF has 10 of these and is at the high end on 6. Significant power disparities, encouraging alcohol consumption, a young workforce, use of coarse language, single gender dominated culture, and a homogeneous workforce. Only 2 are reflected in the path. Proper considerations of institutionalized and systemic factors that create the conditions where sexualized language is used to diminish others requires the CAF to shift away from the current focus on the weak individual. Harassment incidents and lack of reporting are not because people haven't read the definition or don't know how to report. There are strong social factors that are intentionally created by the CAF that set these conditions. Addressing these factors means challenging some central held tenets of the profession, facets that are key to success, but also create unhealthy conditions. Obedience to authority, normative conformity, and group loyalty are essential, yet can also create intense social pressure to fit in, to conform, and above all, stay silent. Power and hierarchies are critical to effective command, but signal that it's acceptable for individuals to use social power against others. Members need to know their buddy will have their back when the brown stuff hits the rotating object, but this means people are constantly judging others to see if they measure up. And outdated stereotypes continue to put women under the microscope to constantly be tested and forced to prove they can do the job. My comments lead to a key issue. The first objective of Operation Honor is leadership-driven culture change. There still is no clarity on which aspects of CAF culture are to be changed and which will be allowed to remain the same. The central question for this committee is if this is a decision CAF leaders make on their own. Finally, as with my other colleagues, I would identify I'm speaking on the basis of my academic expertise, but would note as a slight correction that after 33 years, I retired with the rank of naval captain. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
All right. My apologies, sir. But thank you very much, Dr. Okros. So we'll open the floor for questions. Madame Alislev, please.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much. Given that this is our last day of scheduled testimony from witnesses, I have a couple of questions which I think will be key to how we spend our time with witnesses today. The first of those is whether we have any advice whether the military ombudsman will be appearing before the committee on this topic, as the question of whether the former Chief of Defense Staff was allowed to remain in office when these allegations against him were known. And my second question is whether we've had any indication that the minister would like to return now that we've had a second Chief of Defense Staff subject to investigation. And according to media reports, for more than a month, and again, the minister did nothing, but left it to the Chief of Defense Staff to voluntarily step aside. So I wonder if we have either of those indications, because it will, I know in my case, determine how we spend time today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Garrison, but that's really not a point of order. It's more a debate, but we can just stand by for a minute. Can tell you that the former ombudsman did reply to the summons and affirmed he will attend next Wednesday. Yeah, the other questions, it is debate, but we'll go on with questions. Madame Elleslev, please.
Point of order before we move on. Madam Chair, for whatever reason, when you're speaking, we just get a screen on here that says House of Commons. We cannot actually see you through the Zoom virtual meeting. And just to add to Mr. Garrison's, I don't believe that what he's talking about is debate. He's talking about procedure and conduct for this meeting based upon any future meetings that we may have and witnesses that we may want to call. So it is germane to the study at hand, and I believe that it is admissible to have these discussions.
Mr. Bazan, I'm sorry, I disagree. We have published the notice of meeting for this particular meeting. We have very esteemed guests with us today who have a lot to offer the situation and the discussion. And if you want to have this discussion at the end of the meeting, I'm pleased to do that. But please, we will. If you're asking for me to put aside 15 minutes at the end of the meeting, that I can do.
Please do so.
All right, Madame Elleslev.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for some fundamental testimony. From each of your statements, you've made it clear that there remains a problem in the Canadian Armed Forces with respect to this topic, and that progress has barely been made, if at all. That the military culture is by design strong, and that policy is not successful necessarily in changing that culture. And now that we see that it's at the most senior level, that they're not isolated incidents, and that more officers are implicated by their actions and or their silence, we recognize that this problem has actually been 30 years in the making, because military culture starts at military college or as junior officers. And so when it comes to the battle between policy and culture, policy is clearly losing. This is not the first time. We had the sexual harassment and racism prevention program in the 90s, and that summarily failed. And now we have attempted to do a similar repeat with Operation Honor without changing the foundational elements. So my question to you all is, how do we change the fundamental cultural elements? It clearly cannot be done from within. And even more importantly, how do we set the tone and hold all of those who may be complicit in perpetuating the culture at these senior officer levels accountable?
You can, if anyone has an answer, just go ahead and jump right in. Okay, I think Dr. English.
Well, I can start. I mean, that's a great question, a very complex one. It sounds like one we go over in some of my seminars, but I think, you know, the short answer in all of this is that armed forces are very good, and the Canadian Forces is excellent in dealing with short-term, well-defined problems. And that's what they're set up to do. But because they have very rapid turnover in leadership positions, every 2 to 3 years, the leaders change, they have a lot of trouble maintaining focus over long-term problems. And that's why they're generally, in my view, not very effective at long-term problems. So the only way to be successful, and I think just about everyone's mentioned it, is to have an external body, a truly external body, to hold people to account. So even though the senior leadership might change, and just as a small fact that may interest you, over the 5 years between when Operation Honor was released and the Path to Dignity and Respect was released, there were 7 vice chiefs of the defense staff. and the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff was responsible for the oversight of Operation Honor. So that is just a pretty stark example of one of the reasons why it didn't succeed. So to me, an external body is essential. One example.
Would you include in that external body an external body to hold people potentially who have committed infractions accountable as well?
I would personally, I think I'd separate them out. I think there needs to be one to supervise the culture change, and then another one perhaps to hold individuals to account, because the culture change job is such a big project that really needs a dedicated group. And you know, the most recent example was after the Somalia scandal and the Somalia reforms, the minister appointed a minister's monitoring committee that reported directly to him, and he was able to hold the CAF to account. But anyway, there are lots of different models. I think I'll stop there and let others talk.
All right, Dr.
And Dr.
Latke.
Elgroes?
Oh, go ahead.
Am I going first or?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
You please.
Okay. So speaking of culture, I think we can recognize the opacity of the current culture, and I want us to switch the framing from operational effectiveness to organizational effectiveness. Op Honor framed misconduct as a problem that undermines operational effectiveness. And I think moving forward, it would be prudent to talk about organizational health. Organizational effectiveness is a prerequisite for operational effectiveness. And the way that the forces get ready for operations is through training, exercises, certification. You plan for and you practice until your instincts are right. And even in difficult, complex environments with high stress, sleep deprivation, you will perform in a way that is consistent with your training. And on the other hand, we have Op Honor training, which consists of passing on information about sexual misconduct. It's ticking the box, and we don't worry so much about how the information is retained or applied beyond monitoring who's up to date on their training and who's not. So while I fully agree with my colleagues that it's important to look at culture, I think it's important to look at culture through different phases of the career. And to look at how military identity is developed throughout these stages. But I also really believe in the importance of some more bureaucratic fixes, and training is one of them. And we need to give this kind of training as much important as the other types of training that happen in the military. So here, I think a different approach is needed. And
Thank you. I'd like to hear from Mr. Okros if I could.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll make two shorter comments. First one is we tend to talk about CAF culture, and I think it's important to recognize there's multiple facets of culture internally within the Canadian Armed Forces. So it's a complex issue, and that's one of the challenges is understanding what culture looks like and how it's lived down at unit levels, at small team levels, because there's differences. And so that's the first part that I would offer. The second comment to concur with Dr. English's comment, there is a difference between understanding and implementing culture change versus investigations of wrongdoing. They require different mechanisms, they require different frameworks, and they lead to different outcomes and initiatives. So I think I would agree with we need to keep these two things separate.
Outside of the Canadian Forces, or do you believe they can do it from within?
I do not have the expertise to talk on detail, but I would point out that there is a lengthy history of research and review of military discipline and justice systems, including by previous committees. And I think care needs to be taken when there's efforts made to make changes to those.
All right, thank you very much. On to Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Robillard, please. Yes, hello everybody. Thank you for being here with us today, and thank you for your service. I know that the topic we'll be discussing is a very sensitive subject, and I'd like to really thank you for your time. My first question is for Dr. Stephanie van Kletke. As a founder of the organization Women in International Security Canada, could you tell us more about your work in that regard? Thank you very much for this question. I see you've done your homework. Yes, it's true that I was the founder of WISE Canada more than 10 years ago now, and it's an organization that's dedicated to diversity, to the issue of representation and participation of women in the world of the field of international security. And I think we have to understand that in these discussions, in this context, that the issues of diversity are intimately linked to the problems of military culture that we're discussing today. We all know it. It's really a source of concern for the CAF. We saw it in the defense policies, and we also saw this with their goals of representation of women in the CAF, the objective of 25.1%, which it seems will not be achieved. But I think it's important in this context of a crisis to ramp up our efforts in terms of integration and representation of women in the organization. And there's also the question of representation of women in leadership positions. Both are important. We know we have very reliable data on the effects of diversity on organizational performance. And it's not different in an organization such as the Canadian Armed Forces. Diversity can only be of benefit in terms of reaching the objectives of cultural change in the CAF. So at WISE Canada, we also focused on the idea of mentorship, and I think here it's also important to give the necessary support to women who are in the CAF and who face challenges through the different stages of their career, and to adjust these mentorship programs and develop them so that succession can be strong and participate in the cultural change of the organization, rather than promoting a culture of silence or where assimilation is often a strategy of survival. Can you tell us more about the role of women in defense in order to progress to this change of culture, given your experience as a founder of the Women in International Security Canada organization? All right, I will continue if you want to learn more. First of all, I'd like to say that we focus a lot on the role of women, but I think we should not limit ourselves to that. We should also look at other underrepresented groups. So when we talk about diversity in the CAF, we also we focused a lot on women, but there are other groups that are underrepresented. So we have to continue to measure progress on this front. Progress is beginning to be encouraging. If we look at the younger generation, there's an increase in the representation of women there. And I think that Canada's playing an important role as an international leader on the representation of women in various ranks. And I think there's a good opportunity here to implement this path for women in the organization, also to promote networking that goes beyond the Canadian Armed Forces and defense. So there's also a professional diversity that's showing up in the defense team. So we also have to look at the dynamics of collaboration between the military and the civil people. So when we talk about the participation of women in defense, we have to broaden our field of vision to have an increase in women's participation in the CAF, but also in the broader organization, which includes all the members working for the Department of Defense. So with representation and participation at all levels with the non-military personnel and military personnel, I think we have to give room for the visibility of women at the leadership level. It should have been done earlier, but a period of crisis would suggest that that's even more necessary. So allow me to ask my second question to Dr. Okras. Dr. Okras, what kind of role do the leaders of the chain of command or should they play in terms of changing the culture in the CAF?
I believe there is a very strong commitment to doing so. As I mentioned, it's still not clear exactly what parts of CAF culture are to be changed and what parts of CAF culture are to be remaining the same. And I think that clarity would be helpful. I also would suggest that leaders require an expansion in their leadership toolkit in order to be able to do this more effectively. When we will look externally to other organizations that have put a focus on diversity, they have adopted inclusive strategies. There are approaches to inclusive leadership. It's why I made the comment about the narratives that some leaders use when they seek to build teams. They don't necessarily use language or phrases that are going to be resonating with all members of the team. So I think there is more support that can be given to leaders so that they can do what they know they should be doing.
Merci
Thank
beaucoup. All right, over to Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses we have here this afternoon, on this lovely Friday afternoon, for discussing this very important issue which affects us all, especially these days. I would like to ask a question to Mrs. Van Klatke. Sorry about my pronunciation. I think it was probably all right. In terms of the duty to report, gives rise to an under-reporting of inappropriate behavior. So should there be a change of the regulations for the duty to report? So in Operation Honor, in their plan, they said that their 9005-1 of DOAD, intervention on sexual misconduct, and that was in an effort of dealing with victims, dealing with the process of reporting sexual misconduct. But I'm concerned about to what point does the duty to report give rise to under-reporting of inappropriate sexual behavior in the CAF? Maybe other witnesses would want to answer, but I'd like to hear what you have to say, Mrs. Klatke, on that subject. Yes, as you know, probably, I'm not in favor of that policy because I believe strongly that the victims of sexual abuse or harassment have to be on board to do this. I also will use the opportunity of answering this question to say something else about the more informal procedures, because we talk about the formal procedures for reporting this, but there are all kinds of informal procedures to deal with situations at the lowest levels of the organization on an informal basis. So as a researcher on issues like this in the military, I think it's a blind spot for us. Even if this reflects popular strategies, we have to ask ourselves whether this serves the victims and survivors of this. So you talked about the lower levels of the organizations. By that, what do you mean in terms of the hierarchy? So if there's an incident, there is the possibility of having an informal settlement. And that's an issue that must be raised in this discussion. So we often talk about the more formal procedures of reporting, but there are also more informal possibilities. And for us as external researchers, it's harder to understand the dynamics involved. Thank you very much. I think that Mr. Okros wanted to talk about this issue. Mr. Okros?
I would offer that there are two principles that are in tension in this discussion. One of the principles is legal accountability. And of course, formal investigations and legal accountability cannot occur if formal reports are not made. On the other hand, the thing that we do know is that on many occasions, individuals would prefer to have issues handled at a more interpersonal level and not go through formal reporting and formal investigations. So I think it's important for us to recognize these are in tension. One of the options that has been adopted in other contexts has been a shift more to a duty to respond. If you were aware of circumstances happening, that you would have a responsibility to respond. That could be simply speaking to somebody to ensure they have support, to ensure that they know that they have got the right referrals, and potentially to encourage them to put in a report. But there's a range of ways in which individuals can support each other. The duty report basically creates a really significant dichotomization. If you recognize and acknowledge that something happened, if you wanted to reach out and support somebody, if an individual wanted to confront an individual, simply to say what you did was inappropriate, I want an apology, stop. The duty to report triggers a requirement to make things formal sooner. And it can be a barrier that prevents people from doing some of these more interpersonal interventions, which Dr. Van Hecke was talking to. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Did you...
Excusez, j'attendais la fin de la traduction. Depuis le début de nos...
Since the beginning of our sessions on the topic, we hear much being said about the culture in the CAF in that regard. So we see that there is quite possibly a huge problem there. So in terms of that culture in the Canadian Armed Forces, to your mind, what is the proper solution? Is there one solution or more so that there be more reports, that the cases be better reported? So I'm addressing this question to all three witnesses. Am I wrong if I say that the problem in large part is because of the culture in the armed forces?
Hand raised, so we'll start with him.
Great, thanks. I mean, just to follow on from the others, I mean, I've read the latest DAOD 9005-1 on sexual misconduct, and frankly, it's very long, and I find parts of it contradicts itself. And I was discussing with a colleague the other day about duty to report, and on one hand, it's saying, well, you know, you report here, and you disclose here and it doesn't get reported, you disclose here and it does get reported, you disclose here, it doesn't get reported at first, but maybe it will get reported later on because someone in a profession has a duty to report. So I would think for your average person, it would be quite complex to figure out exactly what's going on. And I know why they write the DOADs the way they do. They're written by lawyers and bureaucrats to cover all the bases. But I would think for the average member, it would be quite difficult to decipher that. But going back to the culture question, that really is, I think, you know, the substance of my arguments is that in the end, it doesn't really matter how good your rules and regulations are or how open to reporting you are. If people know within the culture that anybody that reports will be ostracized, bullied, harassed, have their career ended, then it doesn't really matter how good and clear your regulations are or how open you say you are. And many, many times, many organizations, including the CAF, have said this. So I think that's why it goes back to the fundamental problem of changing the culture. And I have to reemphasize that my colleagues are a little more optimistic than I am about the path to dignity and respect, but it calls for cultural realignment. It's assuming that everything's not so bad. Well, I'm afraid most people have said it is pretty bad, and it needs more than realignment. It needs comprehensive change. And until that change happens, it doesn't really matter how many rules and regulations are made about reporting. People aren't going to do it. And that's, we've had many reports done on that and have explained why. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We need to go to Mr. Garrison, please.
Merci infiniment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Having a little trouble getting off mute. And now I'm having the same technical problem of the echo coming back very strongly in my ear. So if we can just get that solved.
We'll look into it.
Okay, can I, nope, still not working. Chair, I'm prepared to try again. It seems it may have been solved.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much. As indicated by my point of order at the beginning, I do have a problem today, and I think it's a problem that other members of the committee share. And that is that these witnesses have many very good ideas I'd like to discuss with them about how we can make progress on attacking the problem of sexual misconduct in the military. But I have doubts, and I believe that members in the public and more importantly, members in the Canadian Forces have doubt about the understanding of this problem at the highest levels and about the commitment to actually making progress at the highest levels. So I think all of the witnesses made reference to the importance in one way or another of leadership buy-in. And so I want to ask them whether they believe it's possible to make progress in the face of serious doubts about senior leaders' commitment to this process and understanding of this process. And I'd like to start with Dr. Blonhutke.
Thank you. I think that there is probably some doubt when it comes to the understanding and commitment in moments like these. You're right to highlight that. And there has been a lot of defensiveness in the past as well in terms of reacting to problems as they arise. And of course, 5 years ago, that's where we were as well. But I think that despite these doubts, I don't think that we should wait until the next CDS to be appointed to take decisive action. The commander of the Army has been asked to step up, and there needs to be an immediate call to action and stress the importance of this crisis-like situation for the people. I mean, there are a lot of people in the Canadian Armed Forces, and right now they need to hear from their leaders. The well-being of the Canadian Armed Forces members, victims, and survivors especially is paramount. People need leadership in times of crisis. General airs it right now, so this is obviously needed from the PM and Defense Minister too, but Canadian Armed Forces members will look to their service commanders and CDS to set the tone So immediately, I mean, we spoke to deeper change, cultural change, and that's certainly necessary. Sexual misconduct cannot always be cut away as a problem to solve onto its own. We've tried, all three of us, to really emphasize the connection between military culture and the prevalence of sexual misconduct. And then there's the more immediate questions that have been raised in the last few weeks. And we need to reverse engineer this problem. The question that needs to be answered immediately is, how do officers get to the top of the hierarchy while abusing power? How can the incentive structure within the CAF change so that abuses of power are not explained away or covered up by subordinates, peers, and senior leaders alike? So I've stressed this in my opening statement, but abuses of power have not been adequately addressed as part of the op honor journey, according to me. And this should motivate a series of adjustments across the board, from training approaches to communications to leadership to data collection, and should not distract from the broader effort of culture change, which we've all tried to really underscore today.
Dr. Okros, would you like to contribute to this discussion?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just offer it's important to make a differentiation between commitment and understanding. I would state that I believe leaders at all levels are committed to addressing the issues. I think, as all three of us have commented it, and has been observed by women's organizations externally, the gap is in the understanding. And it is, as I tried to say, it is at one level easy to see, easier to understand why it's difficult to understand it. Again, one of the phrases people use is, it's hard for fish to discover water. It's difficult for people that are completely immersed in a very strong, dominant culture to really understand what that culture is. So again, I think this is why some of the calls for the assistance of those that have external academic and professional perspectives to bear to assist senior leaders in understanding the culture and then helping them to figure out what the culture change initiatives can be. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. English?
Go ahead, Dr. English.
Sorry, I just pushed the wrong button there. Right. Well, just to follow on from that, I think, one of the issues is exactly about what leaders believe. And I think, General Thibault made a very perceptive comment, is that his lack of belief in Justice Deschamps' conclusions was based on his own personal experience. He didn't see it. And we know from research that this is true, that we form biases and we tend to favor our own personal experience over academic studies, for example. But it goes back, I think, to this key point is power. And many of the behaviors that go on, and they're not all related to sexual misconduct, has been pointed out by a number of speakers, is it's related to maintaining and keeping power. So one of the main things you have to do when you want to do comprehensive culture change is to make significant changes in the leadership. And the Canadian Forces has rarely, if ever, been willing to do that. And that comes down to oversight. And then I'll make the last point very briefly, because it was brought up, is about demographics. And until you change the demographics of the forces, get more women in, get more diversity, the experiences are going to remain within this homogeneous group that doesn't really believe in change. And I think the leaders have said that. Thank you.
I had Mr. Garrison ask another question. I'll let you go a little bit longer.
Okay. We had last weekend the very brave, I guess I'll call it testimony, although it was not formal testimony, but public statements by Major Brennan, in which she pointed out, I think, what Dr. English just talked about. There was both sexual misconduct and abuse of power in her case. But the most disturbing thing to me was her allegation, and let me stress that I do believe that we should believe victims when they speak up in what are very dangerous circumstances for them. What she said was that her case was widely known among senior leaders in the military, And so when I hear senior leaders saying we take this seriously and we'll make sure there are consequences, and then we hear from victims who say this was widely known and there were clearly no consequences, I find this is a major problem for trying to tackle this. And I guess I would ask Dr. Van Hatke if she has any response to the testimony of Major Brennan.
Go ahead, Dr. Van Latke.
Thank you. Yeah, this is what I wanted to highlight in my statement, is that I think that there are instances and certain scenarios and situations that haven't been properly embedded in training, or how Op Honor has been presented and rolled out. And I think situations of asymmetric professional relationships and consent in those cases is not something that is well understood as a dynamic, and people are often quite uncertain as to how to respond to those types of relationships. And so when we're rolling out training, we're presenting some of the very obvious cases of perpetration of sexual misconduct, and what we need to show is the range of situations in which that occurs, and how questions of consent can manifest themselves across the board. And then you practice these scenarios, and you think about these scenarios, and you have broader conversations about this, so that you have a better understanding of the complexity of the issue, but also then you feel more equipped to respond and to speak out. So I wanted to stress this particular dynamic because it's been front and center in the past few weeks. And when reviewing things like training materials, with the caveat that I do not have access to all training materials as an external expert, but when reviewing some of these training materials and reviewing the academic literature and research reports on this topic, it's a very perpetrator-focused approach. And so we need to really engage with the complexity of what is sexual misconduct, and engage with other themes linked to military culture. And I've listed them during my statement, so I won't repeat it here.
Thank you very much. I need to go to Madame Gallant, please.
Madam Chair, and through you, Dr. Okrust, we now have two successive CDSs who've had allegations made against them, one of whom was in charge of Operation Honor. Do you believe these events and the way they're being handled will hinder women coming forward with sexual misconduct complaints in the future?
Thank you. Madam Chair, the only comment I would really make with this is, which I think we all recognize, is individuals are certainly watching the processes that are unfolding and are going to be paying attention to the outcome once investigations are completed and once cases are deemed to be closed. Beyond that, I don't have any factual information or sufficient knowledge of either of the cases to make any comments about how people are reacting to these as they're in process. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Latke, please.
Can you? Okay, go ahead. Dr. Latke.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, so then Dr. Okrust, we committee on Monday from a military law expert that Minister Sajjan could and should have launched an investigation using his powers under Section 45 of the National Defense Act when he received an allegation of sexual misconduct against a former CDS. Does the minister's failure to act undermine the credibility of Operation Honor and outreach to recruit more women, since there is no safe recourse for military members, and they feel perhaps they cannot count on their own minister to investigate?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My expertise is in military culture and military identity. It's not in military law. I don't know what factual information was reviewed in making any observations on the appropriate use of the NDA.
Do any other witnesses have any comment on that question? Okay. In your opinion, is Operation Honor salvageable? And I pose that to all three witnesses.
Dr. English?
I think the first thing we have to do is understand what Operation Honor is. And it was a campaign plan. And it was, as a campaign plan, it was to be a short 2-year intervention to change, to address Madame Deschamps' report. So as a campaign plan, if you actually read it, Operation Honor, the active phase, actually ended on the 30th of June, 2017. Now, the fact that there was no strategy published afterwards really left the Operation Honor group without any direction. And that's why I say a lot of their actions were uncoordinated and ineffectual, because the campaign ended on the 30th of June. They were in the maintain and hold phase starting the 1st of July, 2017. So you see a lot of progress reports, some fragmentary orders, frag-Os, and this and that, but they contradict each other. So I think what the Path to Dignity and Respect attempted to do was put out a new campaign plan, which I'd be happy to comment on later. But for now, let's just say Operation Honor is done.
Okay, so does the duty to report the inappropriate sexual behavior extend to everyone at the Department of National Defense, be they military, civilian, contractors, or political appointees? Anyone? Oh, okay. And to make comparisons to the United States in the 90s, there was a crisis of sexual misconduct that was already alluded to in the Navy and the Marines. The events and culture was captured by that tailhook scandal. That resulted in some big changes, notably a reporting system outside the chain of command. Can Canada learn some lessons, and should we be looking at what our Five Eyes allies and others are doing effectively?
Dr. Okros.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would certainly say that the Canadian Armed Forces has been engaged in examining and looking at what has been done amongst Five Eyes in particular, as well as in other military contexts. I think that the broader issue with this, of course, is there are many militaries that are recognizing that they have some of these issues. There are some national differences across contexts, but I think from the comments that the three of us have been making, there are some commonalities across many militaries. The continued issue, the issues specifically with regards to reporting and reporting mechanisms involve law and legislative requirements, and there have been differences in particularly the case of the United States, Australia, France, where the legal regime that they are working under have allowed them to explore some options that the Canadian Armed Forces has not yet been able to have.
All right, thank you. I'm going to have to move on to Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and to all our three of our witnesses. Thank you very much for being here. I'm learning a tremendous amount. I think my colleagues are learning a tremendous amount from your testimony. You have all spoken about culture and the role that culture plays in this problem, and perhaps plays a role in the fact that it's not being dealt with appropriately. So I have a two-part question. Why does this culture exist in the CAF? And do you think it is unique to the CAF?
Dr. English and then Dr. Okros.
Right, I'll start off with that one. The culture that exists now in the Canadian Armed Forces is sometimes referred to as a warrior culture. Now, this warrior culture came into the Canadian Armed Forces in the early 2000s when we started cooperating very closely with the United States in Afghanistan, and after 2005, when General Rick Hillier became Chief of the Defense Staff and wanted a warrior culture to replace what he called a bureaucratic culture that existed in the Canadian Forces at the time. the bureaucratic culture that was chosen because of, the warrior culture that was chosen because of our close association with the United States, was a particular culture that had been created in the United States in the 80s and 90s, which was based on, I'll just look at my notes here, a hyper-masculine, sexualized military culture that had actually been created to keep LGBTQ people out of the military, and later this was deployed against women. So this was an artificial, foreign, hypersexualized culture, which according to American researchers who have researched this culture, contributed to, quote, creating or sustaining a cultural environment where sexual assaults can occur and thrive, unquote. So by importing this American hypermasculine culture, we've really created a lot of our own problems. And I think one of the first things any culture change would have to do would be to go back to what we put into Duty with Honor, our Profession of Arms manual in 2003, which was something called the Warrior's Honor. And this new Canadian warrior culture in response to the Somalia crisis was to be based on the warrior's honor, that he would or she would use the minimal amount of force that was possible to achieve their objectives, and that the warrior had a responsibility both to carry out their mission, but also to respect the laws of war. And this is quite different from what we've got now. So I would think that's the first thing that's got to change. Thank you.
Dr. Okros?
Thank you. The other comment that I would make with this is there does need to be a unique military culture. Canadians require very specific things from the women and men that are providing security for Canadians. That requires some very specific things. There's no other employer that has the concept of unlimited liability, that expects and requires people to put themselves in harm's way. So to do that, to generate those capabilities and the capacity to endure under what can be really arduous circumstances does require something unique that most, private sector employers don't need. So the issue is, what should that culture be? And I think that's the issue that is really up for debate and discussion. And they think, again, what the comments that we're providing here is there is a tension in the military as well, around evolving over time. One of the things that is baked into the military philosophy is that there are really important lessons that have been learned that were paid for in blood over the centuries that we will never forget. That is of importance, but that can hold the military back from trying to envision the future military culture that they need to be building for 21st century security contexts and with young Canadians who are seeking to serve their country in uniform. So it needs to be a unique culture. The debate really is about what should that culture be, what should be retained, and what needs to fundamentally change.
All right, thank you. And I'll take this time to please ask both committee members who are asking questions and our honorable witnesses to keep their answers as short as possible. We've only got probably about another half hour of this discussion. So on to Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe. Yes, I have the impression that I'm not going to have a lot of time. I have so many questions for you. You're all experts in your field. And you saw what happened in the news, as everyone did. So I'm going to ask you a question. I'd like you to answer to the best of your knowledge and in all honesty. With what happened, I'll start with Professor van Gladky, and then we'll go to the other two witnesses. In your opinion, did the Minister of Defense do his duty to ensure that allegations of sexual misconduct were treated as they should have been, and that at the highest levels of the hierarchy of the forces, with what you know and your expertise in the field? I would say that we don't know enough about it at this point to be able to answer that. So I'd like to allude to what my colleague, Professor Okros, said earlier. Information will come out through the investigation processes, which will allow us to reflect on the question in a deeper way, but it's brand new. So at this point, you don't even have a slight idea as to how that was managed? Well, I read the same articles in the media that you did. Well, you are more of an expert than I am. You're a PhD and I'm not. But maybe Mr. Okros could answer my question.
I have seen in the media significant speculation over information that people are assuming. I don't know what the factual information is. I do appreciate, again, the principles of maintaining privacy for individuals, the principles of not confounding an investigation, because when information can be disclosed in the public domain before an investigation is completed, it can undermine the capacity to see it through to a proper justice at the end of it. So again, I just don't have information to be able to answer the question at this stage. Thank you.
OK, à ce moment-là,
So in that case, I'm sorry, because I imagine I'll have the same answer from Mr. English. But you see, there's a difference between what happened between Mr. Vance and Mr. MacDonald. So in your opinion, Mr. Okros, was it the right decision to take Mr. MacDonald, who decided to retire or to withdraw?
Actual information to make a decision, and it's not my area of expertise. Thank you.
All right, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Please.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just will note that what we have is investigations into incidents. We are not having investigations into the way incidents have been handled. And so we're probably going to be just as blindfolded at the end if the only focus is on the investigation of individual conduct. While I do, of course, respect the need for that to proceed independently and fairly, there is the question of how the incidents were handled. Because we have such little time, and I have in particular very little time, I want to ask a question to Dr. Planhatki, and I'm not asking you to judge the qualifications of any particular person, although I will have to say that seeing General Whitecross go into retirement and rather than into a senior leadership position seems like a missed opportunity to me. And so what difference would it make in the Canadian military if we saw a woman commanding one of the forces or being the chief of defense staff?
Well, I suppose that your question prompts me to think that if Whitecross hadn't retired, she would have the perfect qualifications right now. You remember, who was speaking 5 years ago and taking the microphone and speaking to these issues, and it was General Whitecross, and she's moved on in terms of her professional trajectory to Rome as the commandant of the NATO Defense College. So there could have been an opportunity there. She was at the appropriate rank level. And certainly when you have a woman at the holding the highest position of leadership within an organization, it has transformative potential. So while I don't want to speculate about who might be tapped on the shoulder next or what the selection process is going to look like into the future to replace the CDS, if that's the decision that's made. I do think that it's a very positive step for an organization to have a woman at the highest levels, because it has a transformative potential for the culture, and potentially it can bring a new model of leadership for which can then inspire further change. So I'll leave my comments at that.
Right. Thank you very much. On to Mr. Benson, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all the witnesses for being here today. We've talked about the defense minister and how he's handled these allegations over the past couple of years. And we don't know all the details, but I think one of the things for sure that we know is that he probably could have acted quicker in many cases. And because he hasn't, I think that's created a problem within CAF, especially for female members. So could you, all the witnesses, talk a little bit about how we retain female members in the armed forces so they don't want to leave early? And also, how do we recruit new female to join the armed forces? So I think we have two big problems there. Can you enlighten us on how we can do that? I know we talked just a second ago about having a female CDS, but that's not going to happen right away. So what other things can we do to make this a better environment for our female CAF personnel?
Lutke?
Thank you. I would certainly welcome this opportunity to review how we can better focus on the unique needs and experiences of women in the Canadian Armed Forces. If it takes a crisis to precipitate more attention to this issue, then so be it. But in general, and I think it's been the big push behind integrating a gender-based analysis plus tool into the way that the government of Canada develops its policies. And here, this certainly applies to the Canadian Armed Forces because the experiences of women are different than men. And we pointed to some cultural factors for why that is, but there are other reasons as well for why they may have different needs and different experiences. And at every career stage, once again, whether it's at the moment of recruitment or whether that's at the moment of release in the transition from being in the military to reintegrating civilian lives, women face unique challenges. And so if we can, use this opportunity as a way to further study what these unique challenges and needs are, then I definitely think this would be a step in that in that direction, a good step in that direction. At the same time, I don't think that we should assume that what's going on right now, what's playing out in the media, is a central decision-making factor, for a woman, either in terms of considering her career options in the military or whether or not she's considering to join the Canadian Armed Forces. There are a host of motives and reasons for why women make decisions about their career, and that may that may have an impact, it may not, and it's certainly just one consideration among many.
Dr. Okros?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I'll start by saying I'm probably the last person to speak on behalf of women serving in the Canadian Armed Forces, and it's the point I'd like to make. Inclusion strategies, when we are looking at diverse peoples, use the phrase of nothing about us without us. And if we apply the WIMP security agenda principles, one of the things that should lead to is the recognition that women need to be empowered to represent themselves, and that includes with agency, with voice. So I think we need to be thinking about, and I would offer both in terms of what the CAF does internally, potentially for the deliberations of this committee. I think it is important to ensure that the voices and perspectives of those that we wish to speak for are actually being heard and being considered. In the long run, creating mechanisms of voice so that individuals and subgroups within the military can be heard effectively would be a good strategy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that what we're seeing here is that there are some cases where an institution cannot monitor itself properly, and it needs outside independent review. Especially like we can talk about Operation Honor. It probably needed some outside oversight for accountability. Can you talk about any international best practices from NATO countries in NATO or our Five Eyes partners that have some monitoring systems so that they can monitor a program like you said, Operation Honor doesn't exist anymore per se, but another program like that? Any ideas on outside monitoring, independent monitoring? Anybody?
Doesn't look like it, Mr. Benson. And
Okay.
your time is up anyway. So
Okay, thank you.
On to Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And I too would like to thank our witnesses for their expertise and their service and their presence here this afternoon. I'd like to just briefly go back to the minister's statements before this committee just about a week ago and cite some of the statements that he made, which I think are strong and constructive. The minister said we need a complete and total culture change. Our actions to root out this insidious behavior must match our words. The time for patience is over. And change will not and cannot happen on its own. And this, in my mind, really engages us with a fundamental connection with the concept of democratic control of the armed and see what we need to do to accelerate change and to really treat this as a watershed moment, if that's the right term. Professor van Laatke, your fourth of your opening remarks, I think, is very poignant on that. You said, and I'm paraphrasing very slightly, if a person does not engage in sexual misconduct, that does not mean that that person performs his or her duty with honor. And you say that the standard of performance is much higher than that if you want to get to zero tolerance. So there was a very helpful testimony this afternoon across party lines and across witnesses with respect to there being a constructive element to culture, but also a toxic negative element to culture. We also have to keep in mind that we have a system. The Canadian Forces are a system of recruitment, of promotion, of service, of discharge. That system is in place, and it can yield positive outcomes, but also with the wrong cultural direction, negative outcomes. So I wanted to ask you, bearing in mind that even in 2016, there was a StatsCan report that came out that I think said 27.3% of women surveyed across the branches of the service elements and military contractors reported sexual assault, not just sexual misconduct, but assault. This is really a moment where we need to think differently. What are the disruptors that can help us to change the culture in a much more accelerated way? And I'm thinking about things like rewarding people, even for broader actions like being gender champions, champions for women in peace and security, all the way up to promotional change. Are there currently in the human resources part of the system of the Canadian Forces sufficient incentives to reward those who want to stand up and drive the agenda forward in a constructive way? And if not, what kind of elements should we build and look at? And sorry, that's to you, Professor van Laatke, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, you mentioned the champion for women, peace and security. And, while I think this is an important leadership role, I think that, the question that you raised perhaps isn't directly connected to the mandate of the champion for women, peace and security, which really refers to a broader agenda. Certainly, talking about women's representation and participation is part of that role. But when you're talking about specific career incentive structures and promotions, that might lie a little bit outside of the scope. However, I think that we're not satisfied with the status quo, and one way, of course, in such a system like the military would be to take a look at the incentive structure around promotions. What are the professional incentives that could be reviewed and tweaked in order to encourage and reward the kind of behavior that we want to see, which is more support for victims and survivors, a supportive environment for those individuals to come forward. And so we probably need to look at peer-to-peer support systems there, and also leadership conduct. And I do think there is merit to looking at how promotions are made and reviewing incentive structures around career advancement in order to create a more supportive environment.
Just really briefly, because I'm tight on time. Pardon me. The minister, just going back to the minister's comment that we need a total culture change. I think those were his words. Is tweaking enough? And if not, what could be done that is more than tweaking that really helps us to accelerate these changes?
Dr. Okros?
I think all three of us have indicated that no, tweaking is not sufficient. But I go back to my comment that we need to have a proper understanding of military culture, of what's working, what's not working, what to keep, what to change. To paraphrase a former prime minister, I would offer now is the time to commit sociology. I would offer that the work by Raewyn Connell that explains militarized masculinities, the work by Kimberly Crenshaw that helps us understand intersectionality are essential to bringing the right lens and the right perspective to really analyze the culture, and that then can lead us to some identification of the changes that are made. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We need to go on to Mr. Bazan, please.
Hi, Madam Chair. Can I pass on my line of questioning to Ms. Aleslav, please?
Okay, Madame Aleslav.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I greatly appreciate my colleagues giving me the opportunity to ask some more questions. I'd like to actually continue on the line of questioning that we just heard around what does fundamental comprehensive change mean, and what sorts of experts should we be looking to? I mean, we have history and politics professors joining us who are very important to give us perspective on how we arrived at this point. But things like war, morality, the military profession, what is the role of a military in a democracy, and therefore how and what should that culture look like in a modern era of defense and security? These are, I think, just as important questions as understanding what we need to do immediately. So could you give me some ideas on, in your opinion, from your background, who should we be looking to consult next on such an important topic?
Directed to anyone particular, or no?
All of the wise witnesses that we are so privileged to have today.
Dr. Okros had his hand up first. We'll go with him.
So I will continue. I referred to it briefly, and my training is in psychology, so I have an understanding on those interpersonal levels. But I would suggest, from an academic perspective, there certainly are individuals from sociology, those that can apply critical feminist theory, critical race theory to analyze and understand. So this is from an academic perspective. But I would also point out there are women's organizations that have been looking at these issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace in multiple organizational contexts. They've got perspectives, they've got years of experience working in this domain, I think, that can be useful. And I also point out there are civil society organizations that are specifically focused on the experiences of women in the Canadian Armed Forces, such as It's Just 700. And I think that those views and perspectives should be heard. They're talking to those that have served or currently serving. They're hearing about lived experiences.
But
and
if I could just take a dimension on that, ultimately because of a National Defense Act, ultimately because a military actually is the only organization that has the ability to take a life in aggression, so to speak, and is responsible for the management of violence. All of those civilian organizations, while absolutely important, would not necessarily have the background and expertise of why a military needs to be part of a democracy, but somewhat outside of a democracy, because they have rights and privileges that go beyond what most citizens have. And it's those 2 points, as you said, that we need to address. So who specifically can speak to where those two things in that context meet?
Briefly, Madam Chair, if I could, I recognize that. However, the issue that we are talking about is interpersonal conduct amongst members of a team. And I think that in that context, there are organizations that understand those dynamics. And I've suggested to help us understand It's multiple views and perspectives that need to be brought together. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And Mr. English?
Thank you, Madam Chair. For me, the key is a multidisciplinary group that includes lots of different points of view. And I think Madame Alislav's point is very well taken, is you need some people that understand the military culture, because even to read some of the documents, they have their own language, their own bureaucratic language, and there are codes in there, and there are things that are being said. And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand what they're sometimes saying to each other. But the bottom line is, as I always say, what gets rewarded gets done. And General Vance, between Lieutenant Colonel to General, was promoted 5 times in 10 years, 1 promotion every 2 years. And what got rewarded was his operational success. And the forces always puts priority on operational success. And that's an interesting debate to have.
But could you
No, I'm
comment,
sorry,
though,
the time
on
is up. We're
conduct?
running out of time. So
Thank
on to
you.
Mr. Bagnall, please.
Yes, I'll be sharing my time with Mr. Bagnall.
All right. Do you want to start off then, Madam? Or go ahead, Madam.
I just have one quick question for Dr. Okros, and then I'll share my time. I was just wondering, it's something you said in your opening remarks about the daily things that can undermine identity and a sense of belonging. And I know that we're talking about the very overt and very obvious forms of sexual misconduct or even sexual violence, sexual assault, but it's really those day-to-day interactions that create culture. It's the small things that happen to people as they go through their work lives. Things like, for instance, an off-color joke that is said in front of other people in an intent to humiliate and diminish someone. And then if the woman actually files a complaint, she gets attacked. She's told she doesn't have a sense of humor. Or, even just dismissive and patronizing statements like, well, I believe that you believe that. Or other forms of gendered microaggressions, loaded language, the things that people experience every day, I think, from what you said, Dr. Okros, really forms the culture, which then enables the other worse forms of sexual misconduct. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on the women, but also on the institution of these kinds of microaggressions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the extension beyond this is the issue of creating social hierarchies. Every workplace, every group has social hierarchies of who's the most important down to who's the least important. And these are the things that are being policed, commonly using sexualized or racialized language and references. And so, as the Honourable Member has mentioned, when people put in these snide comments, when women make an observation are ignored, and then their male colleague says exactly the same thing and isn't applauded, these are the day-to-day practices that send signals about who's important, who's valued, and who's not. And when people seek to create these hierarchies and police them, rewarding certain individuals based on characteristics and attacking others, that's what starts damaging the identity and the belonging. And so I think it is important for us to be recognizing it. It isn't unique to the military. What I tried to identify are some facets of the military, such as the importance given to normative conformity, obedience to authority, the differentiations of rank, the power differences. These things can accentuate those and make it more difficult. As I said, some of these are essential for operational effectiveness, but they're double-edged swords because they get used against people as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Larry?
All right, go ahead,
Okay.
Mr. Bagnall.
Thank you. And thank the witnesses. Have been very, very helpful. It's been great to hear your input. I'll just ask one question or a couple because the time will run out. Maybe start with Professor Von Hackley and then Dr. English, Professor English. And basically, I think you've convinced us all that culture is the major problem. But I'd just like some more technical steps, like action plans, like on day one you do this, and this. What exactly do we do now to change the culture that you've all said needs to be changed? And if you have time at the end, that's my most important question. But Professor Von Hackley, if you say at the end, if you've noticed I don't know what your work has been, if you've noticed this culture in other organizations. And Professor English, I was interested in that you're done a study of the history of the military. What was it like way back? Thank you.
Who was that question directed to, Mr. Bagnall?
Well, the first one was Professor Von Hackley, and then Professor English.
Okay, I can start and be very quick. So I've tried to outline a few paths forward because I do think culture manifests itself in things like leadership and what they say and training and so on. So I tried to identify certain paths through which this can happen. But I also think that the broader point about how you change culture, you have to cultivate an awareness and a mindfulness of the behaviors that to someone outside might seem unacceptable, but within the organization get routinized in the day-to-day to the extent that they become invisible. And I think this is part of what we're getting at there with the idea of culture change, is to cultivate a sense of self-awareness and group awareness about which behaviors and practices are problematic but have been buried under the guise of normalcy through repeated interactions and day-to-day practices. And that's what's important to uncover. And that's where external engagement is especially needed and has been advocated for today.
All right, thank you. I'm afraid your time is up, Mr. Bagnall. On to Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, this will be my last turn of questioning. So thank you to the witnesses for your time, your answers, your expertise, which is highly appreciated. So final question, again, for Mrs. van Glatke. Professor, knowing that Mr. Vance was the mastermind of Operation Honor, in your opinion, what are the measures? And we've heard several times that were measures that were negative in terms of the number of reporting. So what were they in Operation Honor? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. Maybe it wasn't very clear. Maybe I didn't express myself clearly. In Operation Honor, there were measures put in place, and we see that there was a decrease in the number of reports. So, in your opinion, what measures led to that underreporting associated with Operation Honor? So I think there were some measures put in place that encourage some people to participate in the reporting procedures. But the issue that we mentioned earlier, the duty to report, and it's the fact of imposing the victims and survivors to do so is problematic in my opinion. And I'll repeat the fact that I sincerely believe that the approach that should be taken is that the victims and survivors can fully be in control of this process, and that they feel they trust in the process, and we put them at the center of what we do in terms of procedures. And as a woman, an expert in the field, in your opinion, what should be the priority of the CAF rather, in terms of reporting inappropriate behaviors at a sexual level? Well, we should recreate a climate of trust, because without that, there will all be problems in terms of reporting. And as I said in my statement, it's been 5 years now. We have a lot of data now. And we also discovered some blind spots. And the other thing that's important is the abuse of power, the asymmetry in terms of power between individuals. because, and these are exaggerated because of a rather rigid hierarchy that's found in the CAF. So as a researcher, that would be something to be studied further. Thank you.
Where's Mr. Garrison?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Given that I was the one who made the request that we move on to some next steps here, especially seeing the importance of the rebuilding trust question, I'd just like to thank the witnesses today, and I'll give up my time so we can move on to that discussion.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Garrison. And on behalf of all of the members of the committee, I learned a lot today. I just wanted to say, and I've done a lot of reading on the topic, and I learned a lot. And I'm very, very grateful that you took time out of your very busy schedules to join us here today. You gave us a lot to think about, and hopefully we'll be able to turn that into something that will make a difference. And we'll keep in touch, and maybe we'll need your help again sometime in the future. So merci à tous, and
thank you to everyone.
And all the very best to all of you. Thank you very much. All right, that looks good. Before we, you take the floor, just one thing I need from you. The former ombudsman has requested the presence of his legal counsel on Wednesday. So it's not an extraordinary request, but it does require the permission of the committee. So is there anyone who is not in favor of allowing him to bring his legal counsel?
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Okay.
So, given that the last time we discussed this, it was determined that he would have parliamentary privilege, what would be the course of action if his lawyer advised him not to answer a question? If he's released from any response or from the government, why would he need his lawyer there?
As I said, it's not an extraordinary request. I think the committee, if he does not answer a question and you want the answer to that question, I think the committee will repeat the question. And and if he doesn't answer and the committee has asked for an answer, then it has to go to the House. Okay, that's where it goes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
That's the next step. All right. Right, so no objections to him, our witness, bringing his legal counsel. Okay, that's good. Thanks. We have 10 minutes left.
Sorry, Madam Chair, my hand has been up.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you. So it was today. That was the first time I learned that I guess, are proposing a special meeting next week. And it would be helpful, I think, for all of us. I know the official notice hasn't gone out and
it hasn't gone out because it has not confirmed, but I can tell you now that he has agreed to appear.
Okay, and there's no implied criticism there, anyone. I know we're moving quickly. But given that's the case, and the military ombudsman will be appearing, I have one comment and one question. As he reports to the Minister of Defense, I guess we'll be asking him if he's been released from of any restrictions on his testimony, because he's not an officer of Parliament. There's a tendency to forget that. And he is someone who reports to the Minister of Defense. And so I guess I'm not sure, maybe that's our first question to him, is that we're being assured that if he chooses to answer or not answer questions, that's on the basis of his own personal legal advice and not on any instructions from the department. And the second question is, now that we're having him appear before us, I believe that we should offer the minister an opportunity to return to the committee after that testimony and make any further statements he wishes to make, and also to make any clarifications he'd like to make on the current situation with the second Chief of Defense Staff under investigation. And if there's a desire to do so, I could do that by a formal motion. But I would like to see us agree that we extend that invitation to the minister as a courtesy to allow him to reply after we hear that testimony. And I would hope there would be agreement to do so.
We'd like to talk to this. Monsieur Robillard?
Yeah, I wish to know only the one person coming as a witness. I mean,
hey, point d'ordre, Madame la Présidente, il y a un francophone qui parle.
So there's a francophone speaking English and cannot be translated. So thank you. Go on. So I will ask my question in French now. We were supposed to receive one person, and now we've seen the minister. Will we bring the minister back at the same time as we ask an expert?
Hey, Mr. Bazan was first, please.
Mic, but just ask, I couldn't hear at all, Monsieur Robillard, if he could put his mic closer so we could hear.
Je ne veux pas prendre tout le temps, là.
I don't want to take all of the time, but I'm wondering why we're adding witnesses when we were supposed to have just one person on Wednesday.
Bazan, please.
Well, Madam Speaker, just to answer Mr. Robillard's question, this issue continues to escalate within the Canadian Armed Forces. I believe that the minister needs now to respond to what's happened with the Chief of Defense Staff. I also think it's only fair, as Mr. Garrison pointed out, that he be allowed to respond to the testimony that we're going to get from Mr. Walborn next week. And because this is undermining the morale of the Canadian Armed Forces, I think each and every one of us should be completely upset with what has transpired over here in the past 5 or 6 weeks. Canadians deserve answers. We need to reestablish confidence and trust of our men and women who serve in uniform. And the only way we can do that is if we're going to bring about some transparency here, which right now the government has been lacking on. So I'm also of the opinion that we need to call in some of our top military commanders, Navy, Air Force, CJOC, Army, NATO, NORAD, our top commanding officers, to come forward to find out what they know, see if they've ever been involved in anything of sexual misconduct. We are, potentially looking at having to replace our current CDS. So I do believe that this is probably some of the most important work that we're going to do as committee, this Parliament. I think it's also becoming clear that this is an issue that Canadians are getting more and more concerned about, and we have to restore trust. And the best way that we can do it as parliamentarians is expand the scope of the study and dive in even deeper.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, please. Thank you, Madam Chair. So, I agree with Randall and James up to a certain point, because we're thinking that after the evidence from the ex-ombudsman, will immediately ask to receive the minister. And I understand that may be the motion that will be introduced. What I'm suggesting is to wait and see what we'll be learning next Wednesday. And after that, we'll decide who we would invite. So to Randall and James, I'm ready for next Wednesday after we meet the ex-ombudsman to say, if you want, we'll invite the minister. I would vote with you. But I think we might also decide to invite other people after the ex-ombudsman's evidence. So what I'm suggesting is that before saying right away that we'll invite the minister officially after the ex-ombudsman's evidence, to see what will happen next Wednesday, and then say we'll invite the minister, or we might invite other people because we might learn new things next Wednesday. So what I suggest is to defer that discussion to after Wednesday, saying that after the evidence we'll invite the minister or other people. So that's my suggestion. It's a kind of compromise. But I think it's more responsible because we don't know what we'll be learning next Wednesday. We don't know if we will need to invite other people. I don't know what you all think of this.
Debate. Okay, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So all I was suggesting here is that we extend the invitation to the minister, should he choose to do so, to appear at committee after the testimony of the ombudsman. I'm not suggesting on the same day, as Mr. Robillard seemed to imply. And I think that's one reason. The second reason is that we have a second issue that has come up in public, and that is the media reports, which we have a second chief of defense staff who appears to have been under investigation for a period of time, and it's unclear when actions were taken, if any, or whether his suspension was a voluntary suspension. That's a second set of questions we didn't have before us when we started these hearings, if we'll call them that, the study. And so for that reason, I would extend the invitation to the minister today to allow him time to consider whether he wants to respond to both of those things. The question of whether there's further witnesses, I do agree with you, Mr. Bernal-Decept, that the question of any further witnesses should be left to a later date. I'm only suggesting today that the minister be offered that opportunity.
All right. Here's the 8th of March is our next official meeting. If you wished, we can put aside time for committee business at that time, or we could have a steering committee meeting, and then we can discuss this. And that way, you will have all the information. And waiting a week, and then I think that's what do you think? Okay, Madame Galland.
Madam Chair, it's a good suggestion.
Yes, Madam Chair. For a steering committee, would that take up a regular scheduled committee time slot, or would that be separate and apart on a different time and or day from our regular scheduled committees?
It depends on House resources. So if the wish is to find an additional time after the 8th of March, then we will ask that and see if we can find one that works. If not, then we would have, if there are no additional slots, then we might have to use one of our time slots.
Thank you.
So is that a plan? If everyone's happy, we will a meeting after the 8th of March, and we'll put aside time to talk about this issue. Yeah, okay. All right. So we have a plan. All right, thank you, everyone. I think that was a very helpful session. And with that, merci beaucoup. Meeting adjourned.